Do you know how it feels when everything in your world begins to come apart without warning? Yes, I was in that location. I considered myself fortunate for the majority of my life. James, my father, was my hero. He created this prosperous company from the ground up, which was meant to be our legacy. He instilled in me the values of fairness and toughness, and taught me everything I know. I spent 12 years working with him, giving the business my all in the hopes that I would eventually succeed him. I gave up everything because I believed it would lead to something greater, even my relationships and late nights and weekends. I was a goddamn fool, it turns out. I should have recognized the warning signals sooner, but it all began to fall apart around 6 months ago. At work, my dad started to distance himself from me. Meetings that had previously involved me were now taking place behind closed doors. Without a second thought, my ideas were knocked down and my opinion dismissed. I initially blamed it on stress. Perhaps Dad was simply under stress, but I had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. The bomb then fell. I was summoned to his office on a Friday afternoon. It was difficult to decipher his expression, calm yet almost defensive. Even before he opened his mouth, I, sitting across from him, could feel the weight of the situation. With a controlled tone, he began, "I've been thinking about the company's future." I straightened my posture and nodded. I thought this was it. At last, he will designate me as his successor, he declared. I believe it's time to bring in some fresh blood, someone with a fresh viewpoint. My chest pounded with my heart. What are you discussing? His hands clenched together. He leaned forward. A new person has been hired to take over operations. Of course you'll still play a part, but his gaze flitted to the window. You will no longer be in charge of things. My mouth became parched. Who? The door opened at that moment. Ethan, my dad's blasted golden boy, entered. Ethan had that arrogant, entitled look and was younger, perhaps in his early 30s. He was the son of a family friend, and I had known him for years, but he had no prior experience in our field. And yet there he stood, as if he already owned the place, in the doorway. Dad announced that Ethan will be taking over as Chief Operating Officer. I felt like I had just been slapped as I looked at him. Are you serious? Dad remarked, averting my gaze. Ethan has a strong background in business strategy. I think his new ideas will help the company grow, I retorted. He's never worked in this field. You're giving the business to him after I've given you more than 10 years of my life? Dad's mouth clenched. It isn't intimate. Not intimate? It was a joke. Everything was personal. An outsider who hadn't worked hard or made any sacrifices was taking my place, according to my father. Beneath the table, my hands balled into fists, but I made myself remain composed. All right, I responded as I stood up. Do as you please. I felt as though the floor had vanished from under me as I left that office. I thought my father would follow me and stop me, but he didn't. He simply let me go. That's when I realized. It was more than just business. This was treachery. The worst part, though, and that was only the start. The following day, I didn't return to work. Hell, I spent the entire week away from home. I was in a daze for those first several days, sitting on my couch, drinking too much, and again playing back that exchange with my dad. My blood boiled every time I imagined Ethan standing in that doorway, grinning smugly. How could my father have betrayed me in that way? He simply threw me away as if I were nothing after everything I had done for him and the business. I wanted to let him know how much he had wounded me by screaming and punching something. However, I was aware. Dad was not the kind to compromise. That was it once he had decided. When Monday finally arrived, I made myself gather myself. It wouldn't help to lie around feeling sorry for myself. I therefore arrived at the office as if nothing had happened, chin up, well-dressed, and eager to impress myself. It's okay if my dad wants to give Ethan the title, however, I refused to let him push me away. But there was a different vibe at work. People were observing me. When they believed I wasn't listening, they whispered. I could sense the change occurring because Ethan's name was already coming up in meetings. He was already beginning to win over my comrades, the same people I had spent years in the trenches with. Then Ethan began to alter things. Quick. It seemed subtle at first. He suggested changes to the workflow, taking shortcuts on tasks that I had meticulously planned. He reorganized departments as if it were inconsequential and added new vendors without my consent. Then things worsened. One morning, I arrived at work to find my team seated in the conference room, but I was not there. The meeting was led by Ethan, who was seated at the head of the table. Stunned, I stood at the doorway. As I watched him go through the slides on the screen slides from a presentation I had been working on for months, my stomach turned. "What's happening?" With a stern voice, I inquired. Ethan looked up just a little. "Oh, you didn't hear from James? Some leadership positions are being reorganized." My chest constricted when I heard my dad's name on his lips. I moved deeper into the space. "This project is mine." "No longer," Ethan said with ease. "Your father believed that I should take care of it." My jaw clenched so tightly that it was painful. "Did he?" Ethan grinned, that arrogant, patronizing grin that made my skin crawl. "If we need your input, we'll let you know." As I stood there embarrassed, I could feel all eyes on me. Even though I knew it was precisely what Ethan intended, I still wanted to snap and tell him to go to hell. I then turned around and left. Later that day, I discovered my father at his office, perusing some documents while seated behind his desk as if nothing were amiss. "You handed him my project?" I closed the door behind me and asked. He didn't raise his head. "It isn't intimate. Bullshit," I yelled. "This is my creation, my profession. You and I have worked together for 12 years to establish this business, and now you just gave it to Ethan as if it were nothing?" With a groan, my dad put the papers down at last. "It's business," he remarked in an unbearably composed tone. "Ethan sees things differently. He will steer the business in a different path." "Which way?" I made a demand. "Because it appears to me that you are preparing him to take my place." Dad's face became stern. "I'm not talking to you about this." "Oh, I'm just meant to let him ruin all I've worked so hard for?" His voice was stern now as he replied, "You're supposed to trust me, have faith, correct?" He wanted my faith, the same man who had taken me by surprise in front of the whole company. I said in a low, menacing voice, "I've earned my place here." "You are aware that I have." Dad's mouth clenched. "You're welcome here." "However, Ethan," I interrupted him, "Ethan hasn't performed well for this business." His features flashed with rage. "Be mindful of your tone." I gave a sour laugh. "Or what? Will you fire me?" He didn't respond. It was all in that stillness. With my heart pounding in my chest, I ran out of his office. I was furious and my hands were shaking. I needed to get some fresh air and get my thoughts straight before I made a mistake. For the next week, I tried to concentrate on what little work one had left. Ethan, however, was everywhere. He began attending meetings that were unrelated to him. He would accidentally omit me from crucial emails. He became the person that more and more of my team chose over me. Then one afternoon, my office door was shut when I returned from lunch. I had lost my nameplate. "What the devil?" I mumbled as I tried the handle once more. A receptionist passed past, appearing uneasy. "Hey!" I gave her a call. "What's happening at my office?" She paused. "I believe Ethan is currently using it." My blood froze. "Pardon me? I believe your desk was moved to the bullpen, my workstation." Within the bullpen. It was indeed there as I strolled over to the open floor plan. Like I was an intern, my desk was pushed into a corner. As I stood there, sensing that everyone was watching me, my heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to yell and toss the fucking desk, but I refrained. I took a seat instead. "Straighten your back, calm down." They were completely mistaken if they believed they could embarrass me into resigning. I wasn't going to die easily. I was in the bullpen for 2 more weeks. Ethan sat peacefully in my office for 2 weeks as I sat at that small desk. After 2 weeks of being ignored, he walked around as if he owned the place, claiming credit for ideas I initiated and seeming like a visionary when all he was doing was profiting from my labor. It was embarrassing. The treatment I received from others was the worst aspect. My team, the individuals I had spent years coaching and directing, hardly looked at me anymore. As soon as I entered a room, the conversation would stop. Even though Ethan was completely incorrect, I could hear everyone laughing with him and agreeing with him. I felt as though I were a ghost, invisible, and my father stopped even glancing at me. But I waited. I continued to grind, keep my head down, and show up. Because the first secretly hoped that if I could simply prove myself once again, Dad would realize his error. He would see that Ethan couldn't manage the business. He would at last see how important I was. I was so damned innocent. At the quarterly meeting, everything blew up. The big one, where the board members, major stockholders, and the entire executive team convened. I'd spent months getting ready for it. I continued to work on the data, make estimates, and come up with new tactics even after Ethan began taking over my tasks. Because I did just that. I kept the business operating. I arrived early that morning, ready to take my proper seat at the table, dressed nicely in a black suit and a clean tie. I was about to remind them of my identity. However, Ethan was already seated in my chair when I entered the boardroom. In the doorway, I froze. I sit there. Ethan hardly raised his head. No longer. I made an effort to grin. Adorable. Get up now. Ethan relaxed, smugly leaning back. James believed that I should do the presentation this quarter. I chuckled. The presentation that I created? Yes, he replied. But James thought it needed new delivery. New delivery, correct. I looked across at my father, who was seated at the head of the table, adjusting his glasses as if this were a routine occurrence. Are you really agreeing to this? Dad let out a sigh. Ethan has participated more in the most recent tactics. I gazed at him. The tactics I created? Dad's mouth clenched. Just take a seat. At my sides, my hands clenched into fists. I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. However, I took a seat. I chose to sit at the chairs against the wall instead of the table because there were no seats remaining. Like a fucking intern, actually. Then Ethan began to speak, and I nearly lost it, I swear to God. As though he had completed the work himself, he went over every word on my slides. I could see several of the board members glancing at each other as he fumbled through the financials, making several mistakes with the numbers. However, nobody spoke, since he was the son of James. The boy with the golden hair, the Q&A followed. Mr. Caldwell, one of the board members, held up his hand. Ethan, you stated that the vendor transition is expected to result in a 12% boost in revenue. Could you elaborate on how you came up with that figure? Ethan stopped. Oh, my mouth twisted. You got it. I held up my hand. Ethan squinted his eyes. Dad's jaw clenched. Mr. Caldwell, however, grinned. Yes? With comfort, I stated, the 12% increase is based on long-term projected savings from switching to direct sourcing. However, renegotiating the transportation contracts is necessary to achieve such savings. We'll probably see a net increase in costs by Q3 if that doesn't occur. Caldwell's forehead raised. Interesting. Did you take it into consideration, Ethan? Ethan's mouth moved. Well, those details are still being finalized. All right, I replied, because the contracts are still pending signing. Ethan gave me a gaze that was capable of scorching steel. I gave a charming smile. Well, we'll need to follow up on that, Caldwell stated. I felt the tension rise in the room as I reclined in my chair. Ethan seemed intent on killing me. Despite his tense expression, Dad remained silent. Ethan fought to get better for the remainder of the meeting. He missed more information that he would have learned if he had done the work. The board took notice. People began trickling out of the room as it came to a conclusion. I remained sitting while Ethan bounded over to my father. Ethan growled, You didn't tell me about the contracts. Dad's lips went thin. You ought to have been ready. Oh, so I'm to blame now, Ethan yelled. He gave me a look and said, Perhaps you should have let him handle it. Dad's eyes grew gloomy. Be careful. Ethan's mouth twisted. Dad, you know what? Perhaps you shouldn't have given me the company if you didn't want me in charge. My chest constricted. Dad turned to look at me. I briefly believed that perhaps he was finally beginning to notice the flaws, recognizing at last that Ethan wasn't suited for this. Just fix it, he said after that, and turned to leave. Ethan stood with his fists clenched and his shoulders stiff. Then his eyes blazed as he turned to face me. He whispered, You think you're so fucking smart. I grinned. No, I simply know how to carry out my duties. You won't prevail, he declared. Dad has already made up his mind. Perhaps, I replied, but it isn't finished yet. Ethan squinted his eyes. Be mindful of yourself. I got up and straightened my necktie. Be cautious, younger brother. It wouldn't be ideal to lose your position before you've earned it. I felt as though I had finally hit a chord when I left the room. However, I felt in my heart that this was only the beginning. This could not be ignored by Ethan. I wasn't either. It turned ugly after that meeting. Ethan was furious, not merely irritated, but vindictive. He began observing me in a way that gave me the impression that he was simply waiting for me to make a mistake. And truthfully, I didn't give a damn, because I felt like I was in control for the first time in months. Even if Dad didn't want to acknowledge it, people could see that I had exposed him in front of the board. They recognized Ethan as the inept phony that he was. Ethan, however, wasn't the kind to die quietly. He began to act shady. The project files came first. I discovered some of my data were gone from the system while working late one night to sort out the mess. Ethan had created with the vendor contracts, the sensitive files, not just any files, corporate memos, vendor communications, and projections. I looked over the logs. Whose account has accessed them, you ask? Ethan's. The following morning, I went to his office and challenged him. He was seated behind my desk, looking quite arrogant. Miss something? My files were stolen by you. Arms folded, he reclined in the chair. It is not permitted to steal company property. I moved in his direction. What do you intend to do? Ethan grinned. Equalizing the playing field by undermining me? He gave a shrug. It was you who made me appear foolish in front of the board. So, this is retaliation? I chuckled. Pathetic. He squinted his eyes. Be cautious, big brother. You are no longer the favorite. You are no longer as protected as you once were. I leaned closer. You lack the necessary competence. Ethan's smile grew dimmer. We'll check on that. The next blow was swift. After a week, Dad summoned me to his office. He stood near the window, gazing at the skyline, his hands behind his back, rigid stance. That look was familiar to me. It was a bad sign. Take a seat, he said. I took a seat. I received a call from Caldwell, he said, turning to face me. My stomach grew constricted. All right. He claimed that you sabotaged the vendor agreement behind Ethan's back. What? I straightened my posture. That isn't accurate. Ethan claimed that you lowered the contract price by disclosing information to the vendors. That is untrue. Dad had icy eyes. The vendors confirmed it, Caldwell added, because they most likely got that tale from Ethan. Dad's jaw clenched. Do you have evidence for that? I gave a sour laugh. Are you serious? Dad came over to me and said, I asked you to help your brother. I was on his side. I got up. While he claimed credit for my work, I was tidying up his mess. Dad's mouth twitched. You are no longer the one in command. Yeah, I really did notice. His gaze grew piercing. Be mindful of your tone. I gave a head shake. So what? Are you going to hold me accountable for something I didn't do? Dad's eyes were as piercing as glass. You have been suspended. I gazed at him. What? You are too erratic. Take a break. I chuckled. Take a break. Aren't you kidding me? Give your key card to Human Resources. With a trembling voice, I said, You're siding with him. Despite everything? This has nothing to do with sides, Dad stated icily. It has to do with leadership. I took a stride in his direction. You deserve whatever comes next if your leadership entails betraying the people who founded this business. Dad's eyes become stony. Avoid putting me to the test. I looked at him for a long time, hoping that he would change his mind. He didn't. I then turned and left. From there, it became worse. My keycard wasn't working the following morning. In front of everyone, security led me out of the building. With his arms folded and that smug little look on his face, Ethan stood in the foyer. Hard day? He uttered those words. I continued to walk, ignoring him. However, I could sense that everyone was watching me like I was a criminal, including the staff members and trainees I had employed. I returned home, consumed too much alcohol, didn't get any rest, and the news came out the following day. Sensitive organizational tactics were detailed in a leaked memo that was sent from my email account. Trade secrets of the company. Enough to violate several contracts with vendors. The headline? Corporate sabotage from within. Can you guess who claimed to have found it? Ethan. Can you guess who was held accountable? Me. My phone exploded. Caldwell gave a call. Then the attorneys. Dad sent a fucking email instead of making a phone call. Termination replaced suspension. With instant effect. Not even a severance package was given to me. No declaration to absolve me. I was abruptly cut off from the business I developed with my own hands by a chilly, clinical email. I spent a lot of time staring at that email. After that, I slammed my phone into the wall. Surrounded by shattered glass, I sat on the floor and simply laughed. Because Ethan would win, of course. Dad would believe him over me, of course. I ought to have anticipated it. I wasn't finished, though. Not even close. I was in a daze for the first week. I didn't leave my apartment after that email. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't eat much. I had spent my entire life with the company, and then it vanished without warning. What's the worst? Ethan was not held accountable. He was widely reported in the business press as the visionary young leader who prevented an internal security compromise at the corporation. At the press conference, Dad was standing next to him, grinning as if Ethan had created capitalism on his own. And me? I was radioactive. No one was interested in working with me. Suddenly, people who used to call me for advice stopped answering my messages. I could have ignored it. I just easily have moved on. However, no, that was not taking place. Because Ethan not only took my job, but also my life. He fed me to the animals, dragged my name through the mud, and then grinned as I bled out. What about Dad? Dad allowed it to occur. That was something I couldn't forgive. What I do best is what I did. I dug. From a silent source came the first crack. I received a late-night email from a former coworker in the accounting division that I had employed years prior. The email was brief. Examine the invoices from the vendors. Take a look at the overages. So I did. Despite having no access to the company, I still had friends in the proper places. And what did I discover? It was enormous. Ethan had been inflating contracts with vendors. By millions, not by a little amount. After overcharging the business, the vendors would reinvest a portion of the excess into shell corporations. Can you guess whose name those businesses were? Ethan's. It was deception. Fraud on an industrial scale. What's the kicker? Dad had approved several of the contracts. Since Ethan had hidden it in the fine print, he most likely didn't even recognize it. However, legally, he participated. My heart was racing as I sat there looking at the files. With this, I could bring down the entire house. I thus gave my lawyer a call. The public was not allowed to attend the next board meeting. It was not intended for me to be present. However, I had contacts, as well as the privilege of attending as a stakeholder. When I entered the room, it was silent. At the head of the table, Dad appeared to have swallowed glass upon seeing me. To his right, Ethan sat grinning as if he had already won. A big folder was slid onto the table by me. Dad, good to see you. Why are you in this place? He asked icily. I nodded at the folder and said, just returning some company property. Ethan's grin wavered. What is this? I took a seat. How about you open it and see? Dad pulled out the binder. As he turned the pages, I noticed a slight tightening of his jaw, but his countenance hardly changed. Bills. Transfers via wire. Shell Corporation documents. Evidence. Dad remarked, This can't be right. Oh, that's exactly right, I replied. You have been investing millions of dollars in fictitious contracts. By the way, that is a felony. Dad gripped the papers tighter. He looked across to Ethan. What on earth is this? Ethan reclined in his seat. This is nonsense. I chuckled. Is it? Because I have 100 pages or more of evidence to the contrary. Ethan's disguise broke. There is nothing you can prove. I grinned. I can demonstrate everything. When the SEC receives the report I turned in this morning, they will be able to do the same. Dad's head jerked in my direction. What? Yes, indeed. This is of great interest to the feds. I leaned back. Wire fraud is a federal offense, you know. A minimum sentence is required. Ethan got up quickly. You son of a... Take a seat, Dad snarled. Ethan stopped. Dad turned to Ethan and gently stood up. Is it accurate? Is it accurate? Ethan's mouth moved back and forth. It's complicated. Dad's expression tightened. You endanger this business? I was resolving the financial issues, Ethan yelled. If he hadn't, I interrupted. Don't you dare blame me for this. The person skimming off the top wasn't me. Dad clenched his fists at his sides. Ethan, I completed it for us. Ethan's tone faltered. For the family! No, answered Dad icily. You took care of yourself. Ethan's gaze expanded. You're not going to allow him to destroy me, are you? Dad didn't respond. He looked at the board instead. Call a lawyer to get legal. Ethan's face lost its color. My father, like a razor, Dad's voice sliced through the room. You're done. 2 days later, Ethan was taken into custody. Federal allegations include business misconduct, embezzlement, and wire fraud. The business issued a statement denouncing his behavior. I was not mentioned. However, people were aware. Despite Dad's best efforts, the harm had already been done. Stocks fell. Contracts were terminated by vendors. The number of lawsuits began to rise. What about Dad? He appeared to be elderly. He appeared to be smaller for the first time. A week later, I discovered him seated behind the desk in his office. As he went over some documents, his hands were shaking and his face was lined. I entered. I said, Congratulations. At last, you chose the wrong son. Slowly, his eyes rose. You believe you've triumphed? I gave a faint smile. No, however, I didn't lose. Dad let out a sigh. What are you looking for? I took a seat. To buy you out. He squinted his eyes. What? Dad, I am aware of the numbers. The business is losing money. Lawsuits will continue to be filed. You won't make it through this. Dad's mouth clenched. And you believe that you can? I leaned forward and said, I know I can. Sell your shares to me. Allow me to tidy up your mess. Dad looked at me for a while. Then he gave a nod. All right. The business was mine 6 months later. I removed the unnecessary weight, canceled poor contracts, re-established connections with vendors. What about the board? They were appreciative of a leader who genuinely understood his role, Ethan pleaded. Federal jail for 5 years. I didn't go see him. Dad took a quiet retirement. He retained his home, wealth, and self-respect. But the truth was known to him. Everyone did. I redesigned the business in my own image, not Ethan's or Dad's. Mine. And I stood in front of the media, by myself this time, and grinned when the stock rose again. Do you regret anything? A reporter inquired. I pondered that for a moment. No, I replied. No longer.